Deep within the scorched ruins of a once magnificent Syrian port city, archaeologists uncovered a clay tablet baked hard by the very fires that destroyed the metropolis. It contained a frantic plea from a desperate ruler, warning that enemy ships had already arrived, that his towns were ablaze, and that his kingdom was entirely defenseless. This chilling transmission from the city of Ugarit marks the violent terminus of an era, capturing the exact moment when the light of the ancient world began to extinguish. The period leading up to 1200 BCE was an era of unprecedented prosperity, globalization, and diplomatic sophistication. Across the eastern Mediterranean, a vast network of kingdoms engaged in complex trade, royal marriages, and treaties, creating a tapestry of interconnected societies. The mighty Hittite Empire dominated the Anatolian plateau. The Mycenaean civilization controlled the Aegean, and New Kingdom Egypt stood as a beacon of immense wealth and power. Yet within a single human lifetime, this magnificent geopolitical architecture was entirely dismantled. Palaces were reduced to ash, intricate trade routes evaporated, and centuries of administrative knowledge vanished into the wind. The sheer scale and suddenness of the Bronze Age collapse remains one of the most profound enigmas in human history, an apocalyptic event that brought down empires so thoroughly that their very existence was forgotten for millennia. For generations, historians pointed to a singular, terrifying catalyst for this widespread destruction, relying heavily on monumental inscriptions left behind by the Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses III. Carved into the towering stone walls of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu are vivid depictions of a massive, devastating invasion by a mysterious confederation of maritime warriors. The Egyptians called them foreigners from the sea, a title that modern scholars eventually translated into the infamous moniker, the Sea Peoples. These seaborne raiders were described as an unstoppable force, a coalition of displaced tribes who swept across the Mediterranean, leaving a trail of obliterated kingdoms in their wake. According to the ancient reliefs, no land could stand before their arms, from the Anatolian highlands to the shores of the Levant. They seemed to emerge from the mists of the sea, heavily armed, bringing their families in ox-drawn carts, suggesting a massive migration rather than a simple military campaign. The physical evidence unearthed across the Mediterranean seemed to corroborate these terrifying accounts of invasion. Excavators digging through the strata of the late second millennium discovered thick, black destruction layers at nearly every major site from Greece to Canaan. The shattered walls of Mycenae and the burned storerooms of the Syrian coast painted a grim picture of violent conquest, leading early archaeologists to conclude that these maritime warriors alone were the architects of this dark age. However, a civilization does not simply vanish because of a border skirmish. The vulnerability of these ancient superpowers lay hidden within the very material that defined their era. Bronze, the miraculous alloy that built their weapons, tools, and economies, required an incredibly complex and fragile supply chain. Copper had to be shipped from Cyprus, while tin was hauled across treacherous overland routes from as far away as modern-day Afghanistan, demanding perfectly secure trade networks to maintain production. As modern analytical techniques advanced, the narrative of a singular catastrophic invasion began to unravel, revealing a much more complicated reality. Scholars realized that the invading fleets were likely a symptom of a broader, systemic failure rather than the root cause of the devastation. The interconnectedness that had brought unprecedented wealth to the region had also created a perilous dependency, where the failure of one node in the network could trigger a cascade of localized collapses. Environmental data extracted from ancient pollen cores, sediment layers, and stalagmites has recently exposed a silent, invisible enemy that preceded the burning of the cities. Around the turn of the 12th century, a severe, prolonged shift in the global climate drastically reduced rainfall across the eastern Mediterranean. This mega-drought transformed fertile agricultural heartlands into arid wastelands, severely crippling the ability of centralized governments to feed their burgeoning populations. The resulting famine must have unleashed an unimaginable wave of human suffering and desperation across the ancient world. Surviving diplomatic correspondence from this period is littered with frantic requests for grain shipments, with kings begging their allies to send food to prevent mass starvation. The once proud rulers of antiquity were reduced to pleading for basic sustenance, watching helplessly as their granaries emptied and their citizens grew increasingly desperate. This intense ecological pressure fractured the delicate social contracts that held these hierarchical societies together. As food became scarce, the stark divide between the heavily fortified, wealthy elite palaces and the starving rural populations became an explosive vulnerability. Internal revolts and peasant uprisings likely tore these kingdoms apart from the inside, with desperate citizens turning on their own leaders long before any foreign sails appeared on the horizon. Adding to the chaotic unraveling of society, the earth itself seemed to turn against the great empires of antiquity. Archaeoseismologists have identified evidence of an earthquake storm, a prolonged sequence of devastating seismic events that struck the fault lines of the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean during this exact 50-year window. Repeated tremors would have shattered infrastructure, collapsed palace walls, and demanded massive resources for rebuilding that these starving societies simply no longer possessed. What emerged from the ashes was not a straightforward tale of conquest, but a textbook example of a system's collapse. Drought, famine, earthquakes, and internal rebellions merged into a perfect storm that overwhelmed the highly specialized, rigidly bureaucratic states of the era. The intricate machinery of international trade ground to a halt, severing the vital copper arteries and leaving the great kings isolated, impoverished, and defenseless. In this light, the identity of the mysterious maritime confederation takes on a tragic, entirely different complexion. Rather than a disciplined fleet of bloodthirsty conquerors, the Sea Peoples were likely a massive wave of desperate climate refugees, displaced by the same droughts and famines that were crippling the empires they encountered. Driven from their homelands by starvation, they took to the waters in search of survival, becoming both victims and perpetrators of the era's violence. The desperation of these displaced populations fundamentally altered the nature of ancient warfare, rendering traditional military strategies obsolete. The great empires had long relied on highly trained, elite chariot corps, a massive investment of resources designed for formalized battles on open plains. The newcomers, however, utilized swarming tactics with light infantry, javelins, and longswords, easily overwhelming the cumbersome chariots in broken terrain and urban environments. As the palaces fell and the centralized authorities evaporated, a profound darkness settled over the Mediterranean basin. The highly specialized skills that had defined the era, such as complex fresco painting, monumental stone carving, and the intricate bureaucracy of palace administration, were entirely lost. In Greece, the syllabic script known as Linear B vanished completely, plunging the region into centuries of illiteracy, where the only records kept were the oral traditions of the survivors. The silence of the ensuing centuries speaks volumes about the absolute devastation wrought by this systemic failure. Populations plummeted, massive urban centers were abandoned for small, defensible mountain villages, and the standard of living regressed by centuries. The grand geopolitical theater of the late second millennium was replaced by isolated, impoverished communities struggling merely to survive in a fractured, hostile world. Yet, the archaeological record also reveals that the end of one world is invariably the beginning of another. Excavations in the Levant have tracked the settlement of a group known as the Peliset, one of the tribes identified in the Egyptian reliefs, who integrated into the local landscape. DNA analysis of their remains has linked them to southern Europe, confirming their migratory origins and showing how the ashes of collapse birthed the culture we now know as the Philistines. The severing of the ancient world's supply chains also forced a profound technological revolution that would forever alter human history. Unable to acquire the tin necessary to forge their traditional weapons and tools, blacksmiths were forced to experiment with a much harder, more stubborn metal that was abundant in the Earth's crust. The collapse of the old networks directly catalyzed the dawn of the Iron Age, democratizing metallurgy and reshaping the tools of both agriculture and war. The vacuum of power left by the destruction of the old superpowers allowed new, highly influential societies to take root and flourish. Without the heavy hand of the Hittite or Egyptian empires controlling the Levantine coast, the Phoenicians were free to build a maritime commercial empire of their own, eventually inventing the phonetic alphabet. Similarly, the highland settlements of Canaan began to coalesce into new identities, laying the foundational roots for the early Israelites. The trauma of this apocalyptic era was so profound that it burned itself into the cultural memory of the descendants who inherited the ruins. The massive cyclopean walls of the fallen palaces were later believed to have been built by giants, as the survivors could not fathom that their own ancestors possessed such engineering prowess. The echoes of burning cities, epic voyages, and fallen heroes were eventually woven into the foundational mythology of Western civilization, immortalized in the Homeric epics. The shadow of that forgotten era still looms large over our understanding of human progress. We look back at the sudden, violent end of such a sophisticated, interconnected world and realize that civilization is not a guaranteed upward trajectory, but a delicate consensus. The ruins of Hattusa and the scorched stones of the Syrian coast stand as silent monuments to the fragility of complex systems. Unmasking the events of 1200 BCE strips away the comforting myth of a singular, easily identifiable villain. It replaces the monsters from the sea with a much more unsettling reality, demonstrating how climate shifts, economic fragility, and social inequality can conspire to dismantle the most powerful institutions on Earth. The true legacy of this ancient apocalypse is its enduring relevance, a mirror held up to the vulnerabilities of our own interconnected networks. Yet, within this narrative of profound destruction lies an equally powerful testament to human resilience and adaptability. The collapse was not an extinction event, but a brutal clearing of the historical brush that allowed new ideas, new technologies, and new cultures to take root. The survivors of the Great Catastrophe did not merely endure the darkness. They eventually forged a new world from the scattered fragments of the old. The silent archives of antiquity continue to yield their secrets, reminding us that every fallen empire paves the way for a new dawn. By unearthing the true causes of this ancient devastation, we reclaim a vital chapter of the human story from the realm of myth. The sea may have brought the raiders, but it was the profound, fragile humanity of the Bronze Age itself that ultimately brought about its own dramatic, unforgettable end.